Hey, welcome back. You're listening to Get Down to Business, the show all about small business jobs and entrepreneurship. I'm thrilled to be joined by Jeffrey Kamys, who has decades of experience working in the technology industry, but interestingly enough, also in the analytics field. Jeffrey is the founder, chief investment strategist, and portfolio manager at Inherent Wealth Funds, which we are going to talk about. Really, really interesting because of his involvement in the sports betting market, and we're going to talk all about that in just a moment. Jeffrey Kamys, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Absolutely, it is a pleasure. So, as mentioned, you you have a lot of experience in that world of technology and analytics, and of course, as the founder of Inherent Wealth Funds, very, very interesting. But you are also the founder, creator, and owner of Dr. Stats, fantasy sports. How did you become so passionate about these two lines of work?
So when I was younger, I played a lot of sports. I grew up in Chicago, played baseball most of my life, and I was, fascinated by how baseball essentially is a counting game. You're counting things all the time. And after things happen a number of times, like in baseball, when a hitter bats 500 times, you're going to see distinctive patterns. And the stock market's really like that as well. And after I got injured, I hurt my shoulder and I couldn't really pitch anymore. I was a pitcher. I wanted to be part of baseball still. And so I started this company when I was in my 20s called Dr. Stats Fantasy Sports. It was one of the very first fantasy sports companies. And we were doing all kinds of cool things with analytics. Now, they're really simple now if you look at them, but we just had portfolios of players. And that really wasn't even done because we're talking about in the days of Informix databases where there were really no databases on the internet at the time. You just had flat pages, and we were creating that. So it was really cool. I wouldn't say I'm on the Mount Rushmore for fantasy sports, but I was one of the first kind of online companies in that business. And I ran it. I really didn't want to work for someone else. I had young kids. I wanted to have kids and kind of grow that and be around. And that allowed me to do everything I wanted to do when I was raising them. So ran that for like 15 years and then kind of got into more of the analytics of how analyzing players is really similar to picking stocks.
Well, if I'm doing the math correctly with the timeline of when you started Dr. Stats Fantasy Sports, it means that you were an early adopter of the World Wide Web, which is pretty cool. And you've continued to adapt and adopt as the host of the Stock Smart podcast. So we'll talk about all of those things, but I am really, really fascinated by sports betting because it's in the news quite a bit. So, tell us sort of where you see things going just in the market overall nationally in that sports betting market.
So one of the things that I would tell you is that, a lot of times they have these analogies of like innings. They'll say like we're in a bull market. Right now we're in kind of a different market, but they'll say something like we're in inning 3 or inning 4. The sports betting world is in inning 0. It's still growing and they're competing. Like in Europe, they're in like inning 3 or 4. It's been around for a long time. But in the US, we're really only talking about legalized sports betting in the last 2 or 3 years. So it's growing very rapidly. There's a fight for consumers and customers. And so it's just burgeoning. And I think one of the cool things, especially about Chicago, there's plans for Bally's to build a casino down on the waterfront there. And
Yeah, it's exciting. That was just announced.
amazing.
Yeah, that was just announced. It's interesting. So that's a perfect segue. Talk about sort of the policy side, the legalization piece of sports betting. I know you follow this very, very closely, state by state, and even nationally. Any sort of comments or trends that you're seeing?
Well, we're going to see the big ones are coming up is California. So the biggest tumblers to not drop yet are California, Texas, and Florida. Texas is going to be further away. Florida's had some legislation attempts, but we're at 34 states now. The last most recent one was Kansas, and Kansas wants to they want to poach the Kansas City Chiefs, out of Missouri, and Missouri is not legalizing right now. But what we're seeing is this fight for territory because what happens is we don't want in certain states we don't want them going somewhere else to do this, right? We want the revenue in the states. So it doesn't make sense to have someone going next door, as they were doing in New Jersey from New York, to not bring the revenue there. And then we saw huge growth when New York legalized in December, January of last year.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm chatting with Jeffrey Kamys, for the founder of Inherent Wealth Fund and the also the founder, creator, and owner of Dr. Stats Fantasy Sports. We've been chatting about sports betting and some of the interesting dynamics of the industry overall. And I do have one more question on that topic. I did see in the news that Disney has entered into the sports betting market as well. What does that mean for the future?
Of course. Well, it means it's mainstream. I think it's like Wall Street comes to Main Street in the sports betting world. And Disney, of course, we all know they own ESPN. So it's a natural for them to turn that into something where, they can also benefit because most of their content, really what drives the sports betting is content, media. So if you have a media company, it makes the most sense to be involved in sports betting. And we see this with, Fox betting. I mean, Fox essentially created the USFL to have more opportunities for sports betting. They brought that back after it's been gone for 25 years or whatever, 30 years. And they brought the USFL back just because they know that people were crazy about football. I mean, football does, 10 and 30 times the business that any of the other sports do in the US. Now, in Europe, it's football or soccer. But here it's, US. But what it gives you an opportunity. This is a great place to invest right now because we're in such the early part of this stage of the business. And that's why I brought together this ETF, an exchange traded fund called IBET, IBET, which is traded on NASDAQ, which is like a grouping of these companies, these 30 to 40 companies that I choose that are in the ETF where there's going to be a lot of in new industries. You have this exposure where it's wide open. You'll have new companies. Maybe they don't do well, but an ETF gets you the exposure to the space without the risk of a single individual stock.
Absolutely, and that's exactly where I was going to go because it sounds interesting. This IBET ETF. And I know you spend a lot of time sharing insight through your Stock Smart podcast, which I encourage all of our listeners to subscribe, of course, rate, review, and share as well. So, what are some of the more interesting holdings in your ETF right now?
Well, I really think Bally's is kind of an interesting company. And again, they're bringing a new casino to Chicago on the waterfront. I'm not sure if the site's been picked yet. That's an interesting company. You also have a company like Flutter, which owns FanDuel, who we're all very familiar with. And FanDuel may be its own public offering soon as well. And then you have things like DraftKings, which everyone knows about, and Penn National Gaming. Those are some of the interesting holdings that are going on. But there's other companies too. If you've been to Las Vegas, and I'm sure you have, and many of your listeners have, there's the owner of the Fremont Street Hotel, which we've all been to old Las Vegas, and that's a company called Boyd's, which actually isn't one of these companies that's growth at all costs. They're making money, and their numbers are really good. And they've actually done extremely well in the past year, more than some of their other competitors.
Well, chatting about Vegas for a second, I know you and I discussed this offline, that the MGM recently purchased the Cosmopolitan Hotel in Vegas. What is going on behind the scenes over there?
Well, so that was one of the few properties that's in that park of hotels the MGM has. Like they have this whole very connected chain of hotels, but that was not owned by them. And that's a fight for the younger generation. Most of this industry really is going to be digital, meaning you're going to be at a saloon or a place where you get a drink and you're going to pick up your phone and you're going to place a wager on your phone. So what they're doing there is that's a demographic bid because that's one of the youngest casinos on the Strip. Very trendy, upper scale crowd, but the right demographic, like the 25 to 35-year-old person who's going to be betting online for a long time. And that move was really to get an upscale hotel with a young demographic.
Interesting. So again, I'm chatting with Jeffrey Kamys from the Inherent Wealth Fund and Dr. Stats Fantasy Sports. Jeffrey, as we come to the conclusion of our conversation, what's the one bit of advice that you have for our listeners? Is this something that they should keep their eye on, and how do they get involved?
Right. You can invest if you're interested in this area by purchasing the IBET ETF on wherever you trade, if it's E-Trade or Schwab or whichever service you use. And I think really in this space, because there's going to be, you don't want the singular company risk. We have great growth. The CAGR in this marketplace is supposed to be 12 to 15% in the next 5 years. So there's great growth. If you want to invest, you can look up the IBET ETF with Inherent Wealth Fund, and that's how you get involved.
Cool. And I know you've got your podcast, and I know all of our listeners will want to follow truly the subject matter expert in this line of work, sports betting, ETFs in general. How can we get a hold of you?
You can get a hold with me searching, Google me, Jeffrey Kamys, Inherent Wealth Fund, or again, the IBET ETF.
Fantastic. Well, Jeffrey Kamys, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with our listeners. I know this is a topic that we'll be hearing and seeing a lot more about, especially in Chicago, but certainly around the country, and we'll be sure to check back with you. Jeffrey Kamys, thank you so much for joining us, and I encourage everybody to check out your podcast. But a quick break, some headlines, commercials. We'll be right back and get down to business. The show all about small business, jobs, and entrepreneurship when we return in just a moment.